Mainstream conservatism today in this country is almost entirely identified with as classical liberalism, the idea that preserving the autonomy of the individual should be the principle which governs society. That's why you see so few Conservative MPs that are socially conservative. To suggest that there are moral rules which people ought to follow is to infringe on people's freedom of choice. But is there another, better way to conceptualise conservative philosophy? My next guest certainly thinks so. Now, joining me in the studio is the conservative political philosopher and author of Conservatism, A Rediscovery, Yoram Hazony. Yoram, first of all, thank you so much for joining me today. I know you've just arrived in the UK straight from the airport to the studio, so I really do appreciate that. Conservatism is in a mess in this country. It really is. Most people who identify as conservative are neoliberals. And even the neoliberals aren't entirely fiscally conservative. So when we have fiscal conservatism disappearing at the moment, conservative socialism going down the drain at the same time, where do we look to rediscover conservatism?
Well, conservatism is, you could say, is the most beautiful and extraordinary fruit of many hundreds of years of English and later British politics. Yeah. And countries all over the world, whether it's America or Europe or elsewhere, I'm from Israel, look to England and to the UK in order to try to understand conservatism. So when we come to a crisis such as what we have now, where even liberalism has ceased to be something that is, I mean, you can say that after the Second World War, liberalism kind of became the public religion throughout Europe and in America and so on. But as of the last few years, even liberalism, people are fired from the jobs for being liberals. Yeah. And the question is, this woke neo-Marxism, which is presenting itself as the new public philosophy, the new public religion in Britain and elsewhere. What is strong enough to stop it? What could possibly stop it? And conservatives have an answer. Conservatism, the Anglo-American conservative tradition is a tradition that is based on the nation, it's based on religion, that looks to the question of how can we make this nation flourish into the future generations going forward? How can we have a life of conservation and transmission? Right. Now, you'll notice that this is not liberalism. It can have some alliances with liberalism. But a liberal is someone who thinks, as you said before, a liberal is someone who thinks, well, look, if I know about the freedom of the individual and the equality of the individual and the consent, then I know everything I need to know about politics. And a conservative says, why no? They're things we inherit from past generations. Those things are necessary so that there should be an England going into the future. How will there be a UK in 300 or 400 years if there's no conservation and transmission? So that's the question that we need to ask. And that, I think, is the role of a conservative party.
Well, at the moment, the Conservative Party isn't very conservative, but we do have a grassroots movement that's growing, calling itself the New Right. And I believe you have a similar situation in America. But touching on American politics very briefly, is Trump a conservative?
Well, in some ways he is, and in some ways he's not. Trump comes out of a tradition that's probably better called nationalist. Right. Although in the UK, as in America and in other countries, there has been a tension between nationalist conservatives and internationalist liberals, globalist liberals, yes. Because liberalism in itself doesn't really have a problem with it being a universal system that simply takes over the entire globe. Yeah. Whereas if you're a traditionalist, if you're a conservative, then you're much more concerned with your particular nation, just as you're concerned with your own tradition. So Trump enters the stage at the same moment that Brexit appears in the UK. And the question is he conservative? Is Brexit conservative? I think that the answer to that question is basically yes. That if Trump's goal is to return to Americans a thinking about their own nation, its traditions, its interests, rather than thinking about the entire globe, then that does make him a kind of conservative. Of course, he could be more conservative.
Indeed. But in that, I think I've identified, or you've identified rather, and articulated the problem that we're facing, in that a lot of our politicians right now are globalist liberalists, or liberal globalists, however you want to term it. Now, the grassroots in the country tend to be nationalist conservatives. And the problem is that we see nationalism as, associated with Nazism. We see it as inherently bad. But is it not the only way to protect a nation from the snake that eats itself, that is globalist liberalism? Is national conservatism the answer? And if so, how do we redefine that in British terms? Do we refer back to Burke?
Well, look, you're right that the word nationalist has certainly been tainted because Hitler used it to describe his biological imperialism. His goal was to take over the entire world, as he wrote in Mein Kampf, and that he called nationalism. Our nation is going to rule the world. A more common sense and traditional use of the word nationalist would be to say that a nationalist is someone who thinks that the world is governed best when many different nations have the ability to chart their own course independently. All right. So that kind of a nationalism, I think, it fits even with certainly with the English tradition going back to Fortescue and Selden and Burke and many others, all the way up to even John Stuart Mill. I think you could argue is that kind of a nationalist, and it is the only answer. I mean, this kind of nationalist conservatism is the only answer when what you're facing is a World Economic Forum whose goal is worldwide liberalism controlled by them. The EU is pretty much the same kind of creature. It would be, it would be nice if it were a confederation of sovereign nations, but that's not what the people running it want. What they want is a kind of an empire, a liberal empire without borders, whose influence will be universal. And of course, we've already seen if you want the UK to be the UK, it can't do that when someone above you is picking up the phone and calling you, telling you what you should be. Which
is why we left the EU. We left the EU and fell into the trap of the WEF as a replacement for global liberalism. But even I'm tripping up on the language here. And is this not part of the problem? And I think this might be part of the reason that you released this. So this is Yoram's new book, Conservatism, A Rediscovery. Can you tell us why you felt that now was the time for this?
Well, I began writing this book after the summer of 2020, when the neo-Marxists, just to pick a watershed moment, the neo-Marxists take over the New York Times and begin firing all sorts of senior people because they're liberals. And at that moment, the hegemony of the old post-World War II liberalism collapsed. There's still plenty of liberals, but at this moment, we're actually watching a kind of a melee to try to determine what's going to be next, what's going to happen next after liberalism. People sometimes call it post-liberalism. And this book is an entry. It says, look, conservatism isn't liberalism. Conservatism is something else, something much more important and much better. And it deserves a hearing to be the next thing after liberalism.
And I can highly recommend this book myself. It helps me articulate the problem, even if I'm not doing so well today. But Yoram Hazony, thank you so much. Conservative author and political philosopher. His book is called Conservatism, A Rediscovery.